Clara Hensley dropped to her knees on the blacksmith's floor, and she didn't care who saw it. She had run out of choices at the same moment she ran out of road, and the man standing over her with a hammer in his hand was the last door left in the world. She grabbed the edge of his work apron with both fists, and she looked straight up at him and said it not softly, not carefully, the way a woman says something she's rehearsed. She said it the way a person says the only true thing left. "Marry me tonight. My brother is selling me to a man I'm afraid of, and if you say no, I have nowhere left to go." Nate Cade did not move. He did not speak. He just looked at her, this woman he had never once spoken to, and something behind his eyes made a decision that would change both their lives forever. If you want to know what he said, stay with me until the very end of this story. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss a single chapter. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far Clara's story has traveled. The summer of 1883 turned Harlan's Creek into a town that smelled like hot iron and desperation. The sun had been punishing the valley for 6 straight weeks, cracking the earth along the riverbed and drying up the smaller wells on the east side of town. Tempers ran short, water ran shorter, and the people who had nothing found themselves with even less. Clara Hensley had been surviving on less for most of her 24 years. She was the second child of Thomas Hensley, a man who had died owing money to half the territory and leaving his 2 children with nothing but a deed to 40 acres of dry land and a reputation that smelled worse than the deed itself. Her older brother, Randall, had inherited their father's temper, their father's debts, and their father's belief that Clara existed primarily as a bargaining chip to be played at the right moment. That moment, it turned out, was a Tuesday in late July. Clara had heard them talking through the thin wall of the boarding house, where she and Randall shared 2 cramped rooms. She had pressed herself against the plaster and listened to every word, her breath shallow, her hands pressed flat against the wall, like she could hold back what was coming. "She's 24, Randall was saying, his voice low and deliberate, in the way it always got, when he was about to do something he knew was wrong. "Decent looking. Knows how to cook and sew. Hargrove's been asking about her for months." The other voice belonged to a man named Cleet Dorsey. She recognized the slow, wet drawl of him, a man who brokered livestock deals and, apparently, other arrangements. "Hargrove's pushing 50, Dorsey said. His last wife didn't last 2 winters. "That's not my concern." Randall's chair scraped back. "He's offering to clear my debt to the land office and put $200 in my hand. The girl doesn't have to like it." Clara had stood there for 1 full minute after the voices moved away from the wall. Then she had picked up the small leather satchel she kept packed under her bed, because somewhere deep in the part of her that had always known this day was coming. She had been ready, and she had walked out of that boarding house without looking back. She had not known where she was going until her feet took her there. The forge sat at the north end of Harlan's Creek, set back from the main street, on a plot of land that the rest of the town seemed to have quietly agreed to leave alone. It was a substantial building, heavy timber frame, stone foundation, a chimney stack that threw heat into the summer air, even at this hour of the evening. The light from inside glowed orange through the gaps and planking, and the sound coming from within was rhythmic and certain, the kind of sound that didn't stop for weather or gossip or the problems of people it didn't know. She had heard of Nate Cade. Everyone in Harlan's Creek had heard of him, in the way that you heard about the mountain itself as a fixed fact of the landscape that didn't require your opinion. He had arrived in the valley 4 years ago, purchased the neglected forge from a widow who was glad to be rid of it, and had proceeded to work it into the finest smithy between Billings and the Wyoming border. He shod horses. He built wagon frames. He forged hinges and latches and tools and anything else that the ranchers and farmers of the valley needed made from iron. He did the work, he took the money, and he did not involve himself in the affairs of the town. He was 36 years old. He had never married. He lived in 2 rooms behind the forge, and he spoke, by most accounts, only when speech was absolutely required. Clara stood outside the heavy oak door of the forge and understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, exactly how desperate she was. She knocked anyway. The rhythmic sound from inside stopped. There was a pause, the kind of deliberate pause that belonged to a man who didn't move until he'd decided to. Then footsteps, heavy and unhurried, and the door swung open. Nate Cade stood in the doorway, with a hammer still in his right hand and a face that gave away nothing. He was taller than she remembered from the few times she'd seen him in town, broad through the chest and shoulders, in the way that came from real labor rather than performance. His shirt was rolled to the elbows and dark with sweat, his forearms mapped with old burn scars that had healed silver against his sun-darkened skin. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, not alarmed, just assessing. "Miss Hensley," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Not unfriendly, but not warm either. Simply factual, the way a man states a temperature. She was surprised he knew her name. She must have let it show, because something moved briefly in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "I know most people in this town," he said. "What can I do for you?" Clara had rehearsed this during the walk. She had constructed a careful, reasonable explanation that began with her circumstances and built logically toward her request. Something measured, something dignified. What came out instead was the raw truth, stripped of everything except urgency. "My brother has arranged to sell me to Clifford Hargrove," she said. "The deal closes tomorrow morning. I have nowhere to go and no one to go to, and I have been walking for 20 minutes trying to think of another answer, and I cannot find one." She looked directly at him because she had decided on the walk that if she was going to do this, she would not look the ground while she did it. "I am asking you to marry me, Mr. Cade. Not for love. Not for anything you don't choose to give, just a name. A legal claim that Randall can't override. I know I have no right to ask this. I know you don't owe me anything, but I am asking." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Nate Cade did not move. He did not change his expression in any way she could clearly read. He simply looked at her, not through her, not past her, directly at her for a long moment that stretched until she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside," he said. Out of the heat. The inside of the forge was brutally warm, even with the fire banked down for the evening. Tools hung on the walls in arrangements that looked casual, but were clearly deliberate, everything placed where a man's hand would reach for it, without thinking. An anvil dominated the center of the space, its surface worn smooth in the places that mattered. Along the back wall, a workbench ran the full length, covered in projects in various stages of completion. It was a working man's space, organized by the logic of work rather than the logic of display. Nate pulled a stool from beside the bench and set it near the open side door where the evening air moved through, and he gestured at it without ceremony. Clara sat. He remained standing, arms crossed, hammer still in his hand, not threateningly, just because he was the kind of man who held what he was holding until there was a reason to put it down. "Tell me what happened," he said. So she told him. She told him about the wall and the voices and the name Hargrove and the $200 and the deed to the land that Randall would use to settle his debts the moment he'd sold her off to clear the most pressing ones. She told him about her mother, who had died when Clara was 11 and left her with no ally in the house. She told him about the 3 years she'd spent building a small seamstress business that Randall had systematically undermined by borrowing against her earnings until there was nothing left to borrow against. She told him all of it without embellishment, because embellishment felt dishonest, and she was not willing to be dishonest with a man she was asking to stake his reputation on her behalf. Nate listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer expressions of sympathy. He simply listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Hargrove," he said, "what do you know about him?" "I know he's offered for 2 other women in this county in the last 5 years, Clara said. "I know one of them left within the year. I know the other one doesn't speak much anymore." Nate's jaw tightened slightly, the first real expression she'd seen from him. "And your brother knows this," he said. It wasn't a question. "My brother knows what he chooses to know," Clara said. "Which is whatever makes the thing he wants to do feel acceptable." Another silence. Nate uncrossed his arms and set the hammer on the bench behind him. He turned back to face her. "I'll ask you something, and I need a straight answer." "All right. If I say no if you walk back out that door, what do you do?" Clara had thought about this on the walk. She had thought about it carefully, because she believed in knowing the answer to a question before someone asked it of you. "I leave," she said. "Tonight. I have $11.04 and whatever I packed in this bag. I walk to the stage road, and I wait for the morning coach, and I go somewhere Randall doesn't know about, and I start over from nothing." She paused. "I would rather do that than go to Hargrove. I would rather do almost anything than go to Hargrove." Something shifted in Nate Cade's face. Not softness, exactly, the man didn't seem built for softness, but a kind of recognition, one person seeing something real in another. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm terrified," Clara said. "But I've been terrified before, and I'm still standing here." He looked at her for a long moment. "The preacher's at the church until 9, he said. He owes me a favor." Clara's breath left her body in a single quiet rush. "I need to clean up," Nate said, already moving toward the back room. "Give me 10 minutes." They were married at 8:47 in the evening by Reverend Aldous Marsh, who asked no questions and recorded the certificate with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that the Lord's business came in forms that defied simple explanation. Two of Marsh's parishioners who had been helping him stack hymnals served as witnesses. Neither of them looked particularly surprised, which said something either about the Reverend or about the general state of affairs in Harlan's Creek. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Nate Cade stood through it with the same still attention he'd given everything else, and when Marsh asked him the question, he said "I do" in the same flat, certain voice he'd used to tell her to come inside. No performance, no hesitation, just a man saying what he meant. Clara said her own words and felt them land somewhere in her chest like stones dropping into still water, sending out ripples she couldn't fully see yet. When it was done, Nate shook Marsh's hand, and they walked back through the warm summer night to the forge. He showed her the 2 rooms behind it, a bedroom, a small sitting area with a table and 2 chairs, a kitchen alcove with a wood stove. Everything was clean and spare in the way of a man who owned nothing he didn't need. He stood in the doorway between the forge and the living quarters, and looked at her with that same direct, assessing expression. "The bedroom's yours," he said. "I'll take the cot in the forge." "Mr. Cade." "Nate," she stopped. "Nate, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm choosing to." He leaned against the doorframe. "I want to be clear with you about something. I'm not a complicated man. I say what I mean. I do what I say. I don't have expectations of you beyond what we've agreed, which is a legal arrangement that protects you from Hargrove and whatever else your brother's planning." He paused. "You're welcome here as long as you need to be. You don't owe me anything for it." Clara looked at him and felt something she hadn't in so long, she'd almost forgotten what it was called. Safe. Not accusingly. Genuinely. "Why did you agree to this? You don't know me." Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew your mother a little. She used to bring mending by when my predecessor had the forge, and we'd talk sometimes while she waited." He looked past Clara at something she couldn't see. "She was a good woman, too kind for the life she got handed." He brought his gaze back to her. "You've got her eyes." Clara didn't trust herself to speak. "Get some rest," Nate said. "Tomorrow's going to be complicated." He was right about that. Randall Hensley arrived at the forge at 7 the next morning, and he arrived loud. Clara heard him from the bedroom, his voice carrying the particular pitch of a man who had expected one thing and found another, and had decided to blame the world for the discrepancy. She dressed quickly, her hands steady in a way that surprised her, and walked out into the forge before Nate could have to manage this alone. Randall was standing inside the forge door, hat in his hand, but not from any impulse toward manners. He'd simply not thought to put it on. He was a wide man, going soft in the middle the way their father had, with a face that was handsome in photographs and unpleasant in person. He looked at Clara when she emerged from the back, and his expression cycled rapidly through surprise, fury, and a kind of calculating reassessment. "Clara," his voice was very quiet. "What have you done?" "I got married," she said. "Last night. Reverend Marsh has the certificate." Randall's gaze moved to Nate, who was standing at his anvil working, as if this conversation were a minor interruption in an otherwise normal morning. He looked up when he felt Randall's attention on him, and the two men regarded each other. "Hensley," Nate replied, "you had no right." "She's a grown woman," Nate said. "She had every right." "So did I." He went back to his work. "I believe we've covered the relevant ground. You're welcome to consult the territorial marriage laws if you have questions. Otherwise, I've got work to do." Randall's face had gone a dark mottled red. He took 2 steps toward Clara and stopped when Nate set down his hammer and turned to face him fully, without any particular threat in the movement, just a man turning to face something. And the implications of his size and stillness doing the rest. "This isn't over," Randall said, directed at Clara. "Yes," she said. She held his gaze until he looked away first. She hadn't been able to do that in 20 years of living. He left without another word. Word moved through Harlan's Creek the way water moved through cracked earth quickly, and through every available gap. By mid-morning, the news had reached the general store, the post office, the saloon, and every back porch and wash line between. By noon, people were finding reasons to walk past the forge. Not everyone was neutral about it. Martha Coombs, who ran the millinery and considered herself the social authority of the town's female population, materialized at the forge door at 10:30 with an expression like a woman who has just found a snake in her sewing basket. "Clara Hensley," she said, "she hadn't bothered to update the name. I think you ought to know that what you've done reflects very poorly on yourself and on the town." Clara was repairing a tear in the canvas of a tool roll she'd found hanging near the workbench. She didn't look up immediately. "Good morning, Mrs. Coombs." "Don't good morning me. You trapped that man." "Everyone knows it. Nate Cade is a decent person who doesn't know how to say no to someone in distress, and you took advantage." "I asked him a question." Clara looked up now and kept her voice level. "He gave me an answer. That's all that happened. You showed up at his door in the middle of the night." "I showed up at his door in the evening and made a legal proposal, which he accepted of his own free will." She held Mrs. Coombs's gaze. "I'm sorry if the sequence of events doesn't match a story you find more comfortable." Mrs. Coombs's nostrils flared. She looked past Clara into the forge, where Nate was working with his back to both of them. "Cade," she called. "Surely you have something to say about." "No," Nate said without turning around. "I don't." Mrs. Coombs left at a pace that communicated her feelings clearly. Clara let out a slow breath and went back to the canvas repair. Her hands had started shaking somewhere around Mrs. Coombs's third sentence, and they weren't entirely steady yet. "You handled that well," Nate said from across the forge. She looked up. He was still working, not looking at her. "I was shaking," she said. "No." He struck the iron. "You did it anyway." The first week passed in the careful way of two people learning to share a space that had belonged to one of them. Clara established routines without being asked. She cooked in the morning and evening, kept the living quarters clean, and occupied herself during the forge's working hours with the seamstress work she'd brought in her satchel and the new commissions that found their way to the forge door once word got out that the blacksmith's wife could sew. Nate worked. He was at the forge before she woke, and sometimes still at it. After she went to bed, the sound of hammer on iron carrying through the wall like a kind of heartbeat she was learning to find reassuring rather than intrusive. They ate together. That was perhaps the most surprising thing, that the meals were not silent or strained. But gradually, haltingly, something close to conversational. On the third evening, she asked him about the burn scars on his forearms. He looked at them as if he'd forgotten they were there. "Apprenticeship," he said. "I was 17. Made a mistake with the bellows. The fire told me about it. That sounds painful." It was. He picked up his fork. "I didn't make that mistake again." On the fifth evening, he asked her about the seamstress work she'd been building before Randall drained it. She told him about the orders she used to take, the bridal work she'd been particularly known for, the ways she'd saved toward a proper machine that would have let her take on heavier canvas and leather work. She'd had $63 saved toward it when she'd found her account at the land office had been redirected to cover Randall's debts. Nate listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What kind of machine?" he said. She told him. He nodded slowly and said nothing else, but the next morning she noticed he'd moved the small side table in the sitting room under the window, where the light came best. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. On the 8th day, Clifford Hargrove came to the forge. He came alone, which told Clara something about his confidence. He was not a large man lean through the shoulder, with the careful grooming of a person who considered appearance a statement of superiority. He wore his wealth in small, deliberate ways: a watch chain, boots that had never seen mud, a hat that cost more than most men in Harlan's Creek spent on a month of food. He did not come to the forge door. He went to the front of the property and called out and waited. Nate went to meet him. Clara, from the side window of the living quarters, watched. She couldn't hear everything that was said. She caught pieces of it, words carried on the summer air in fragments. Hargrove's voice was conversational, measured, the tone of a man who believed he was having a discussion when he was actually issuing a directive. She heard her own name. She heard the word arrangement and the word suitable. She watched Nate's posture throughout. He stood with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not aggressive, just still, the same way the mountains behind town were still. Entirely unimpressed. When Hargrove finished, Nate said something brief. Clara saw it rather than heard it, the slight movement of his jaw, the deliberate brevity. Hargrove's easy manner evaporated. He said something sharp. Nate didn't move. Hargrove said something else. Nate turned and walked back toward the forge. Hargrove stood at the property line for a moment, looking at the back of Nate's head, and then he left. Clara was at the table with her work when Nate came back inside. She looked up. "Well," she said. "He's not going to be a problem," Nate said. "What did you say to him?" He went to the wash basin and cleaned his hands with the methodical thoroughness of a man putting something behind him. "I told him you were my wife. That arrangement was a legal and permanent fact, and that if he came to my property again with the intention of disrespecting that fact, I'd have a conversation with the circuit judge about his last 2 wives and how their circumstances got arranged." He dried his hands. He went pale. Clara stared at him. "That's all it took?" "Men like Hargrove aren't brave," Nate said. "They just count on everyone around them being afraid." He looked at her with that level expression. "If no one is afraid, they don't have much to stand on." Clara looked down at the work in her lap. Her throat was tight in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said. "Don't need thanks," he said. It was true. "You are my wife." He said it the same way he said everything, as a statement of plain fact. No softness in it, no warmth, exactly, just certainty. The kind of certainty that didn't require anything from her in return. She found unexpectedly that it was exactly the right thing to say. On the 11th night, there was a storm. It came off the mountains fast, the way the summer storms in that valley always did, sunshine turning to darkness in less than an hour. The temperature dropping 20 degrees and the sky going the color of an old bruise before the first thunder arrived. By the time the rain hit, it was hitting hard, and the wind had gotten into the gaps of the forge building and was moving through with intent. Clara woke to the sound of something crashing in the forge and the smell of rain on hot iron. She pulled on her dress and boots and went through the connecting door. Nate was already there. A section of the east wall's planking had blown loose in the gust, and rain was coming in at an angle, hitting the far end of the workbench. He was climbing up to secure the plank from inside, working by the light of a single lantern. "Can I help?" Clara called over the noise of the storm. He looked down at her. A consideration, then hold the lantern. She climbed up on the bench beside him and held the lantern steady while he worked. She was close enough to feel the heat still in the iron tools, close enough to see the focus on his face, the same expression he wore at the anvil, wholly absorbed by the problem in front of him. It took 10 minutes in the rain and the noise and the swinging light to get the plank secured. When it was done, they climbed down. They were both soaked through. The lantern had held. Nate looked at her wet hair, drenched dress, lantern still raised in her hand, and something crossed. Not the esmond she was used to. Something quieter. "Good," he said, "just that." She understood him well enough by then to know that from Nate Cade, good carried weight. She set the lantern down and found herself laughing, a short, startled laugh that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She covered her mouth. "Sorry. I don't know why." "You don't need to be sorry," he said. And then, very slightly, the corner of his mouth lifted. It was the first time she'd seen anything on his face that was clearly and unambiguously a smile, and it lasted only a second before it was gone, and she understood instinctively that it was not the kind of thing he offered easily or often. She found herself thinking about it for a long time after the storm passed. 2 weeks in, Randall made his next move. He had not come back to the forge, but he had been busy. Clara learned this from the wife of the man who ran the land office, a quiet woman named Dora Pell, who had appointed herself, with some warmth, as Clara's one reliable ally in the town's female population. Dora appeared at the forge on a Thursday afternoon with a loaf of bread and information. "Your brother's been talking," she said, setting the bread on the kitchen table and sitting down without being asked, in the way of women who consider formality a waste of time they don't have. "He's saying the marriage isn't valid, that you weren't in your right mind when you agreed to it." That Nate coerced still. "That's not true," she said. "I know that," Dora said. "But Randall's apparently been to see Hargrove, and between the two of them they're planning to bring it to the district court. Get the marriage annulled." She looked at Clara steadily. "You should know this." Clara looked at the bread and then at the wall and then at Dora's steady face. "What grounds do they have?" she asked. "None that would hold if you both stand up and say what happened," Dora said. "But Hargrove's got a friend on the district bench, and friends change the shape of the law sometimes." Clara was still processing this when Nate walked in from the forge, having caught the last part of it. He pulled out the other chair and sat down, his forearms on the table, his expression calm in a way that was, Clara had learned, not the absence of feeling but the containment of it. "Tell me," he said. Dora told him. He listened the way he always listened, with the full weight of his attention. When Dora finished, he looked at Clara. "You're not worried," she said. It came out half a statement, half a question. "I'm thinking," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then Hargrove thinks this is about the marriage certificate." "It's not." He looked at Dora. "What does Randall actually need right now? What is he out of?" "Dora," she said slowly, and standing. "He's behind on 3 debts, and if he doesn't show something by end of the season, the land office is going to begin proceedings on the property. So he needs money," Nate said, and Hargrove offered him money for Clara. And now that source is gone, he's trying to claw it back. He looked at Clara. "This isn't about you. It never was. You understand that?" She looked at him. "He's using you the way a man uses a tool," Nate said. "There's nothing personal in it, except convenience. Which means if the convenience disappears, the problem disappears," Clara finished. "Not disappears," he said, "but changes shape." He looked at Dora. "There's a man named Prentice who holds Randall's second debt. He and I have done business, I'd like to have a conversation. Dora raised her eyebrows. You do that? That's not a small thing. No, Nate agreed. He looked at his hands on the table. But it's the right move. Clara looked at him across the table, this man she had known for 2 weeks, who had given her a name and a door that locked and 2 rooms she didn't have to apologize for occupying, who held lanterns in storms and spoke in plain facts and had, apparently, been quietly thinking about her brother's debt structure. Why do you care this much? She asked. It came out softer than she intended. Nate met her eyes. Because you're not a tool, he said. And I don't like watching people get used like one. Dora looked between them, with the expression of a woman who could see something that neither of them was quite ready to name yet. She picked up her breadcloth and stood. Well, she said pleasantly, I'll leave you two to your thinking. She let herself out. Clara and Nate sat across from each other in the quiet that followed, the summer afternoon pressing warm against the window glass, the distant sound of the forge fire settling in its banked state, and neither of them speaking for a moment that stretched long enough to say things without words. Then Nate stood and went back to his work, and Clara looked at the loaf of bread and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like something good might actually be possible. Nate did not go to see Prentice alone. He told Clara at breakfast the next morning, setting down his coffee cup with the quiet deliberateness that meant he had already decided something and was informing her rather than consulting her, a habit she had already identified and was already beginning to push back on. I'm going, she said before he finished the sentence. He looked at her. It's not necessary. It's my brother's debt, she said. It's my name that's being used to settle it. I'll be there. He was quiet for a moment. She had learned that his silences were not empty, they were the space where he weighed things. She waited him out. All right, he said. She had half expected an argument. The lack of one told her something she filed away, without examining too closely. Harold Prentice ran a dry goods operation out of the east end of town and conducted his lending business from a back office that smelled of tobacco and old paper. He was a small man, with a precise mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had learned long ago that people revealed more than they intended when they thought you weren't paying close attention. He looked at Nate, and then at Clara, and then back at Nate when they came through his door, and something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of a man updating his understanding of a situation. Cade, he said, and Mrs. Cade. He said the name with the faint emphasis of a man trying it out. Sit down. They sat. Nate let Clara speak first, not because he stepped back, but because he turned slightly toward her in a way that made the space hers, and Prentice followed the motion, the way people followed direction a room's gravity seemed to go. Clara had thought about what she wanted to say on the walkover. She said it plainly. You hold a note on my brother Randall Hensley for $140, she said. He is currently delinquent by 60 days. He has approached you, I believe, with a proposal to clear the debt through an arrangement involving the land office and Clifford Hargrove. Prentice touched his mustache. I'm not in the habit of discussing the particulars of. Mr. Prentice, Clara said, I'm not asking you to discuss them. I'm asking you to listen. She leaned forward slightly. Randall's plan involves using my name and my situation to leverage money from Hargrove, which he intends to use in part to clear your note. The problem with this plan is that it doesn't work anymore, because I'm no longer available to be used. What Randall is going to do instead, what Hargrove is going to encourage him to do, is pursue a court action that ties up my husband's time and reputation and costs everyone in this room something they'd rather keep. Prentice looked at her with those careful eyes. And what exactly are you proposing? Nate will guarantee your note, Clara said. Full amount 60 days. In exchange, you call the debt due immediately today and you stop taking Randall's meetings. Prentice looked at Nate. That's accurate, Nate said. Prentice was quiet for a long moment, his fingers interlaced on the desk in front of him. Then he said, Hargrove's not going to like this. No, Nate agreed. He's a man who holds grudges. So am I, Nate said. It came out perfectly level, perfectly unaggressive, and landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Prentice looked between them for another moment. Then slowly, he pulled open his desk drawer and removed a ledger. 60 days, he said. Understood, Clara said. They shook hands on it and walked out into the summer morning, and Clara did not let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened until they were half a block away and her knees went slightly uncertain beneath her. Nate noticed. He didn't comment, he simply slowed his pace to match hers. That worked, she said. That was always going to work, he said. Prentice doesn't want a court fight any more than we do. He just needed a cleaner exit. How did you know that? He glanced at her. I've been doing business in this town for 4 years. I pay attention. She thought about that. About the way he moved through Harlan's Creek not as a man who participated in it, exactly, but as a man who had been watching it long enough to understand its architecture. Who knew where the weight-bearing walls were? You're not what people think you are, she said. I'm exactly what people think I am, he said. I'm quiet and I work iron and I keep to myself. That part's all true, he paused. People just assume quiet means simple. She looked at his profile, the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his expression. That's their mistake, she said. He said nothing. But the line of his shoulders changed almost imperceptibly, the way the surface of water changes when something moves beneath it. They walked back to the forge and got on with the day. Randall received the call notice on his debt at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Clara knew because Dora Pell appeared at the forge door at 4:30 with the expression of a woman who had just watched something she'd expected and was still finding satisfaction in. He's furious, Dora reported, settling into the kitchen chair she'd come to treat as her regular seat. Absolutely furious. He went to Prentice's office and Prentice wouldn't see him. Sent word through his clerk that the note had been guaranteed by a third party and that Randall would need to make arrangements to settle by 30 days' end. 60 days, Clara said. Prentice cut it, Dora said with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. Decisive man when he wants to be. Clara absorbed this. Where is Randall now? Last I heard he was at the saloon. Dora's tone conveyed what she thought about that. He's been talking. Saying Nate coerced you. Saying the marriage was done under duress. She looked at Clara directly. He's going to keep saying it, Clara. To anyone who'll listen. Let him. Dora raised an eyebrow. People in this town know Nate, Clara said. They've been watching him for 4 years. They know what kind of man he is. She set down the mug she'd been holding. And they're starting to know what kind of man Randall is. He's had this town's patience for a long time on the strength of my father's name, and that name doesn't carry what it used to. He knows that. The talking is fear. Dora studied her. You sound different than you did 2 weeks ago. I am different than I was 2 weeks ago, Clara said simply. Dora left shortly after, and Clara sat with the quiet that followed and tried to locate the fear that had been her constant companion for so many years. The low animal hum of it that had become so familiar, she'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the sound of a clock. She found she had to look harder for it than she expected. The altercation happened on a Saturday, which was the day Nate drove the wagon to the ranch supply on the northern edge of town for his bulk iron order. Clara had been going with him the last 2 weeks, mostly for the excuse to see the open land outside of town, the way the mountains rose blue and certain at the northern horizon. She had grown up in flat country, and the mountains still struck her as something close to miraculous permanence, given visible form. They were loading the iron stock into the wagon bed when Randall appeared. He had not come alone this time. He had a man with him, a broad-shouldered ranch hand named Walt Greer, who hired out his fists when his back wasn't needed for lifting, and he had the particular forward-leaning posture of a man who had been drinking since before the hour made it acceptable. Clara, he said, her name like a door being forced. We need to talk. No, she said, we don't. She kept loading iron. The pieces were heavier than they looked, and she'd already established her grip and her rhythm, and she did not break either. Randall stepped forward. Greer moved with him. Nate set down the coil of wire he'd been holding and turned around. He didn't say anything. He simply was there, all of him, completely, the way you couldn't ignore a wall even if you weren't planning to walk into it. Randall's eyes went to Nate and then back to Clara. He had always been better at anger, when he was the largest thing in the room. He recalibrated quickly, the way drinkers did, not backing down but shifting the angle. "You've made a fool of yourself," he said to Clara. "Everyone in this town is talking about you, about what you did, about what kind of woman runs to a stranger in the middle of the night." "I ran to the only person worth running to," Clara said. She set the iron piece in the wagon bed and looked at her brother directly. "I have spent my entire adult life doing what you needed me to do. Working for money you spent. Being quiet about things you didn't want questioned. Carrying the weight of your decisions while you got to make them." Her voice was steady. She had not planned this speech, but it was coming out with the coherence of something that had been shaped and reshaped in the place where her fear used to live. "I am done with that. Whatever you do next, whatever you try, you are going to be doing it without me. I am not a debt. I am not an arrangement. I am not a bargaining chip. And I will not behave like one anymore." The ranch yard was not empty. 3 other men had paused what they were doing and were watching. The man who ran the supply counter had appeared in the doorway. Randall's face had gone through several colors while she spoke. He landed on a furious pale. "You think this man—" he started. "I think this is over," Clara said. "Walk away, Randall." Greer shifted his weight toward Nate. Nate watched him do it with the particular attention of a man who has assessed a physical situation and reached a conclusion about its outcome and is simply waiting for the other party to reach the same conclusion. Greer took in Nate's forearms, his hands, the quantity of iron he had been unloading, without apparent effort. Greer looked at Randall. "Might not be the day," Greer said quietly. Randall's jaw worked. He looked at Clara. He looked at Nate. He looked at the men watching. He turned and walked away. Greer followed, a half step behind, and if the set of his shoulders suggested that he thought Randall had made the right call, Clara chose not to examine that too closely. The ranch supply man at the doorway cleared his throat. "Need a hand loading the rest of that, Cade?" "Appreciate it," Nate said. They finished loading the wagon. Clara helped without being asked and without needing to be told where anything went. When they climbed up to the wagon seat and turned toward the road home, Nate looked at her and said, "You didn't need me for that." She considered this. "No," she said, "but I was glad you were there." He kept his eyes on the road, so was I. 3 days later, the thing that changed everything arrived in the form of a letter. It came with the Morning Post, addressed to Clara Hensley Cade, which was the first time she'd seen her new name in print. She turned it over in her hands and read the return address twice before she opened it, because the name on it was one she hadn't heard in 7 years and had not expected to hear again. Her mother's older sister, her Aunt Vera, who had married a man in Denver and moved there the year Clara was 17, and whom Clara had written to twice in the years since, without response, assuming the silence meant what silence usually meant. The letter was 4 pages. Clara read it standing at the kitchen table, and by the 2nd page her hands were trembling, and by the 4th her eyes were burning, and she had to sit down. Vera had written to explain her silence. Randall had intercepted both of Clara's previous letters and had written back in her name, telling Vera that Clara wanted no contact. Vera had believed it because the response was plausible. Clara had been young when Vera left, and they had not been especially close. She had not questioned it until a woman she knew in Billings mentioned, in passing, that she'd run into a girl in Harlan's Creek named Clara Hensley, who had seemed very much alone. Vera had begun looking then. She had found, through the kind of slow, persistent inquiry that only family could sustain, what she should have found years earlier. The last page of the letter was about the land. Their mother's land. The 40 acres that Vera had assumed passed to Randall by default because no one had told her otherwise. She had assumed, and Randall had counted on everyone assuming. But their mother, careful, quiet woman that she was, had left a will. A properly witnessed and recorded will, filed with a land attorney in Billings who had been holding it in good faith for 11 years, under the impression that the relevant parties had been notified. They had not been. The will left the land equally to both children. 20 acres each. Randall did not own the land he'd been leveraging. He'd been leveraging half of it. Clara sat at the table for a long time with the letter in her hands. Then she got up, walked to the forge door, and said, "Nate." He turned from the anvil. She handed him the letter. He read it the way he did everything, in complete, unhurried silence, his expression revealing nothing while his eyes moved. When he finished, he read the last page again. Then he looked up at her. "Your aunt," he said. "My mother's sister. I hadn't heard from her in 7 years." Randall, she stopped. Started again, he intercepted my letters. He's been operating on the assumption that the 40 acres were entirely his to leverage. But the will splits it. 20 acres belong to me. Nate folded the letter with careful hands and gave it back to her. "This changes things," he said. "It changes everything," she said. The debt structure, the court threat, Hargrove's interest, all of it was built on Randall controlling land he only half owns. "If I file the will, the land office has to recognize the split," Nate said. He was already thinking she could see it in the slight focus of his eyes, the stillness of a man whose mind was moving fast. Randall can't leverage what he doesn't own, and the debts he's run against the full 40 acres become debts against only his half. He paused. "Which means they exceed the value of his share. Which means he's insolvent," Clara said. "Which means Hargrove's investment in Randall's plan becomes worthless." Nate looked at her. "And Hargrove will know that the moment you file." Clara sat down on the stool. The full shape of it was landing now, not just what was possible, but what it meant. 7 years. 7 years of being leveraged and managed and used, and the foundation of all of it had always been a lie, a stolen letter, a will sitting in a drawer in Billings. "He knew," she said. "Randall knew about the will. He had to have known. My mother was meticulous about these things. He knew, and he just let me believe I had nothing." Nate sat on the edge of the workbench across from her. He didn't offer a comfortable revision of this. He let it be what it was. "Yes," he said. "He knew all those years," she said. "All those years of working for him, of giving up the money I saved, of thinking I needed him because I had nothing to stand on." She stopped. Her voice had gone to a place she hadn't intended. "I had 20 acres, I had land, I had a future. And he just put it in his pocket and walked on top of me for 7 years." Nate let the silence hold for a moment. Then he said quietly, "What do you want to do?" She looked up at him. "I want to file the will," she said. "Today. Before Randall knows we have this letter. Before he can do anything to prepare." "The land office closes at 4, Nate said. He stood. "It's 1:30. We can make it." He paused. "You'll want to write to your aunt first. She should know you received the letter, and she'll likely want to provide her own statement to the land attorney." Clara stared at him. "You've already thought through all of this." "I read fast," he said. She laughed, the same, startled involuntary laugh as the night of the storm, and a beat lasted longer, and when it subsided there were tears at the corners of her eyes that had nothing to do with grief. Nate watched this with the careful expression of a man who was not sure what to do with someone else's relief, but wanted very much to do the right thing. "Thank you," she said. "I know I keep saying that. I know you keep saying you don't need it." "I don't need it," he said. "But I hear it." He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. "Let's go file your land." The land office clerk, a young man named Effington, who wore his authority in his collar, stiffened visibly when Clara came through the door with Nate at her shoulder and a letter from a Denver attorney in her hand. He stiffened further when she placed the letter on his counter and explained what she needed. He told her, in the prim way of a man who used bureaucracy as a social weapon, that the filing of a previously unrecorded will required a specific form, and the form required a supervisor's approval, and the supervisor was unavailable on. When Nate said, "Will the supervisor be available?" The single, patient word, not aggressive, not loud. The weight of a man who had no intention of leaving. Effington recalibrated. "I can check." The supervisor, a man named Garber who had been in the back office the entire time, appeared within 4 minutes. He read the letter. He read Vera's notarized statement from the Denver attorney, which Clara had found tucked inside the envelope on second reading. He looked at the signatures. He looked at Clara. "This will supersedes the current land record," he said carefully. "Yes," Clara said. "Your brother currently holds active debt arrangements against the full parcel." "He holds them against his half," Clara said, "which is all he ever owned." Garber looked at her. He looked at Nate. He looked back at the letter. "I'll need to pull the full record," he said. "This will take some time." "We'll wait," Clara said. They waited. Nate stood beside her with his arms crossed and his face neutral and a patience that had no edges. Clara sat in the hard chair beside the counter and folded her hands in her lap and breathed slowly. At 3:30, Garber came back to the counter with a folder and a recording stamp. "The filing is accepted," he said. "The record will be updated to reflect the original split. You'll want to retain a copy of this." He stamped the form and slid it across the counter. "Miss Hensley, Mrs. Cade, I'm sorry about the well. I expect this has been a complicated situation. It's been a long time coming," Clara said, and picked up her copy. They walked out of the land office into the late afternoon sun, and Clara stood on the board sidewalk and looked at the stamped form in her hand and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that something enormous had just shifted. Not ended the complications ahead were numerous, and she was not naive about them. But shifted. Randall did not own what he thought he owned. Hargrove's arrangement was built on sand. Her 20 acres were hers, recorded in her name, held in her hand on a piece of paper that no one could intercept this time. Nate stood beside her. He looked at the form and then at her face. "How do you feel?" he asked. It was the most direct emotional question he had asked her. She recognized the weight of it from him, from a man who didn't ask such things casually. "Like I've been holding my breath for 7 years, she said, "and I just remembered I'm allowed to exhale." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's enough for today. Let's go home." And it struck her, walking beside him back through the summer-warm streets of Harlan's Creek, that she had not heard that word home in years and meant it. She meant it now. Hargrove found out about the land filing within 24 hours. Clara would have been surprised if it took longer. A man with his resources and his investments kept ears in every office that mattered. She had been expecting some form of response. What she had not expected was the form it took. He did not come to the forge. He did not send Randall. He sent a lawyer. The man arrived on a Wednesday morning, young, expensive, possessed of the smooth certainty of someone who had learned that a good suit and a confident expression could resolve most of the problems a person was likely to encounter. He presented himself at the forge door with a card and a sealed letter and an expression that communicated benign professional neutrality. Nate read the card. He handed it to Clara. He said, "Come in." The letter was from Hargrove's Denver legal firm. It was 4 pages of careful language that translated, once you stripped away the professional varnish, to this. Hargrove had previously secured certain gentlemen's agreements with Randall Hensley regarding property arrangements. Arrangements that he believed had been improperly disrupted by the filing of an allegedly discovered will. He had reason to question the validity of said will and the circumstances of its discovery, and intended to bring these questions before the district court at the earliest available session. In the interim, he wished to propose a private resolution that would satisfy all parties involved. The private resolution was money. a figure that Clara read twice because the first time she thought she'd misread it. He was offering to purchase her 20 acres, for a price that was, on its face, fair. That was, in fact, generous. That was the kind of offer you made when you were absolutely certain the person you were making it to didn't know what the land was actually worth. Clara looked up from the letter. The young lawyer was watching her with his professional expression. Nate was watching the lawyer. "What's on my 20 acres?" Clara asked. The lawyer blinked. "I'm sorry? What's on my land?" Clara said. "That's making him offer this price. There's something on it that he wants." "Water rights? Mineral access? What is it?" The lawyer's professional expression did an almost imperceptible wobble. "The offer is simply—" "I know what the offer is," Clara said. "I'm asking what's underneath it. Because a man like Hargrove doesn't make generous offers out of goodwill. And this," she held up the figure in the letter, "is not what 40 acres of dry rancher's land at this valley is worth. Not to a normal buyer." Nate had his arms crossed. He was looking at the lawyer the way he'd looked at Greer in the ranch yard, not threatening, just entirely present and entirely prepared. "I'm not authorized to discuss," the lawyer started. "Tell Hargrove no," Clara said. She set the letter on the workbench. "Tell him I'm not interested in a private resolution, and tell him that if his client brings this to the district court, I look forward to presenting the complete documentation of this will's provenance, including the original filing attorney's records and my aunt's sworn statement. Tell him that." She paused. "Can you remember all of that, or would you like me to write it down?" The young lawyer looked at her for a moment with something that was probably not, professionally speaking, supposed to be respect. Then he gathered his card and his letter and his hat. "I'll relay your response," he said. "I appreciate that," Clara said. He left. The forge was quiet. Nate looked at her. "Water rights," he said. "That's my guess. There's a creek runs through the east portion of the Hensley 40. If Hargrove is planning to develop in the valley, he'd need water access." "And my 20 acres is the east portion," Clara said. "Almost certainly." She sat down on the stool. The audacity of it was still settling the years of Randall using her as a pawn, and all of it, ultimately built around water rights that Hargrove had identified and wanted and had been slowly, methodically working toward. "He wasn't interested in me," she said. "He was interested in the creek." "He's interested in everything that's useful to him," Nate said. "You happen to be attached to something useful." She was quiet for a moment. "Then if I keep the land—" "He's going to be angry," Nate said. "Yes, and he has a friend on the district bench." "He does." Nate sat across from her. "Which is why your aunt's statement matters. A Denver attorney and a notarized will and a credible family witness, it's not impossible for a favored judge to overlook, but it's significantly harder to dismiss than just your word." He looked at her steadily. "You also have me. I've been a landowner and a business operator in this territory for 4 years with no legal complaints and no disputes. The court is going to look at both sides and weigh them. You shouldn't have to put your reputation in front of this," she said. "Clara." He said her name in the way he said few things, with a specificity, a directness, that made it feel like a hand placed on a table rather than a word floating in air. "I'm your husband. I know that started as a legal arrangement. But that doesn't mean it's only a legal arrangement." He paused. "Not to me." She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching, without retreating from what he'd just said. Just a man who had said a true thing and was willing to sit with the truth of it. She thought about all the years she had been afraid of what people would do next. Randall, Hargrove, the town, the court. She had structured her life around anticipating the next threat, the next restriction, the next door closing. Sitting across from Nate Cade in the warmth of the forge on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, she thought that she was very tired of being afraid. And she thought, looking at the steady, unhurried certainty of the man across from her, that she might actually have found something worth being brave for. "Then we fight it," she said. "We fight it," he agreed. Outside the forge, the summer afternoon pressed on unhurried, indifferent, warm. Inside, two people who had started as strangers and a desperate question were quietly becoming something neither of them had fully named yet. But the shape of it was there, building the way real things build, not in a moment, but in every small, true, patient choice that two people make to keep showing up for each other. It was not finished, not by a long way, but it had begun. The letter from Hargrove's lawyer sat on the workbench for exactly 1 day before the next blow landed. It came through Dora Pell, who arrived at the forge on Thursday morning, moving faster than her usual measured pace, which told Clara before a single word was spoken that whatever she carried was not good. Dora had a gift for calibrating her urgency to the weight of her news, and this morning her urgency was considerable. "There's a man in town," Dora said, sitting down and not touching the coffee Clara set in front of her. "Arrived last night on the late stage. Name of Whitfield. He's been at the land office this morning and at the courthouse records since it opened." Clara went still. "A territorial claims examiner," Dora said. "Appointed by the district bench." She looked at Clara with eyes that were sorry and direct in equal measure. "Hargrove moved faster than we thought. He's filed a formal challenge to your will's validity. The examiner is here to review the original filing and make a preliminary recommendation before the court session." Clara set down her own coffee cup. "How long does the review take?" 3 to 5 days. If Whitfield recommends against the will, the district judge can rule without a full hearing." Dora paused. "And Clara, the district judge is Harrison Pruett." The name sat in the room. Hargrove's friend on the bench. Not a rumor, not a suspicion, a known fact that the town had lived around for years the way you live, round a bent nail in a floorboard, noting it and stepping over it, and never quite getting around to pulling it out. Nate came through from the forge. He had heard enough. He stood in the doorway and looked at Dora with a face that had gone very quiet in the way that meant he was moving quickly inside. "Where is Whitfield now?" he said. "Courthouse records room," Dora said. "He's been there 2 hours." Nate looked at Clara. "We need your aunt's attorney on record before Whitfield finalizes anything." "Does your aunt's letter have a contact name in Denver?" "Yes." Clara was already moving to the bedroom, where she'd placed the letter in the drawer of the small table. She came back with it and spread it on the kitchen table. "James Aldrin. He's with a firm called Aldrin and Marsh." "Telegraph office opens at 8, Nate said. "It's 10 past. "Let's go." They did not run, but they walked with the purpose of people who understood that time had become a quantity with edges. The telegraph operator, a young man named Coop, who wore his eyeshade as if it granted him authority, took down the message Clara dictated and sent it within 3 minutes. The message was direct. The will was under challenge. A territorial examiner was reviewing the original filing. And they needed Aldrin's statement of provenance and his original file records forwarded to the Harlan's Creek Courthouse by the fastest available means. Coop looked up when Clara finished. "That's a lot to ask in a telegraph." "I know," Clara said. "Send it anyway. Response could take hours." "Might be tomorrow." "Send it now, please," she said. He sent it. They walked to the courthouse next, not because there was anything they could legally do while Whitfield reviewed records, but because Clara had decided that she was not going to wait in the forge while a man appointed by her enemy examined the document that held her future. She was going to be present. She was going to be visible. She was going to be a woman that Whitfield had to look in the eye. Nate understood this without being told. He walked beside her and held the courthouse door and said nothing. The records room was a narrow space that smelled of paper and dust and old decisions. Whitfield was a compact man in his 50s, with the particular posture of someone who had spent decades being professionally unimpressed. He looked up when they entered. His gaze went to Clara, then to Nate, then back to Clara. "Mrs. Cade," he said, with the measured neutrality of his office. "I was expecting to conduct this review without I have every legal right to be present during the examination of my own property records, Clara said. She kept her voice pleasant and her spine straight. I won't interfere with your process. I simply want to observe. Whitfield held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Nate. Nate looked back at him with the patience of a mountain. Very well, Whitfield said, and returned to the documents. They sat in the two chairs along the wall, and they watched. It was not comfortable. Whitfield worked with deliberate slowness, examining each page with the care of a man who was either thorough or performing thoroughness, and Clara could not always tell which. Twice he made notes. Once he paused on a page for long enough that Clara's heart climbed into her throat and stayed there. At 10:30, Randall arrived. He came through the records room door without knocking, saw Clara and Nate, and stopped. The sequence of emotions across his face was almost instructive surprise, then fury, then something calculating that settled his features into a careful arrangement. I wasn't aware this was a public proceeding, he said to Whitfield. It isn't, Whitfield said without looking up. But interested parties have a right to observe. She's not an interested party, she's the subject of the challenge. She is a named beneficiary of the document under review, Whitfield said, with the tone of a man who found interruptions professionally offensive. That qualifies her. Please sit down or step outside, Mr. Hensley. Randall's jaw worked. He sat in the remaining chair against the opposite wall, which placed him directly across from Clara. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her their entire lives, as a problem he hadn't fully solved yet. She looked back at him without flinching. 2 weeks ago, that look would have made her want to fold herself smaller. Today it made her want to sit up straighter, and so she did. The four of them occupied that small room for another hour and 20 minutes. It was one of the stranger hours of Clara's life, 4 people breathing the same dusty air, 2 of them examining documents, 2 of them watching, and the weight of years of damage running as a current beneath the ordinary surface of it. When Whitfield finally gathered his papers and stood, he looked at each of them in turn. I'll have a preliminary recommendation to Judge Pruitt by Monday, he said. The provenance of the will is a matter I'll need to consider carefully. If the filing attorney's records can be provided before then, they will be taken into account. He left. Randall stood. He looked at Clara and he said very quietly, You should have taken the money. No, Clara said. I shouldn't have. Hargrove will get that land one way or another. That's how he works. You'd have walked away with something. Now you're going to walk away with nothing. I have 20 acres that are mine, Clara said. And a husband who didn't lie to me for 7 years. I think that's considerably more than nothing. Something moved through Randall's face, something that might in a different man have been shame. In Randall it lasted only a second before the calculation came back. You think he's doing this for you, Randall said, nodding toward Nate. He's not. He's doing it for whatever he thinks he gets out of it. I know why he's doing it, Clara said. And I know why you're saying that. You need me to believe people are like you, so I'll stop trusting them. She held his gaze. I'm done believing that. Randall looked at Nate one more time. Nate had not moved from his chair. He looked at Randall with the same patient, unhurried expression he brought to everything, and Randall, who was a man built for environments where his anger was the heaviest thing in the room, turned and walked out. The records room was quiet. Nate stood. Denver needs to respond by Sunday, he said. Let's go see if Coop has anything. Coop had nothing. Not yet. They went back at noon. Still nothing. Clara spent the afternoon at the Forge's side table, working on a canvas commission she'd taken on heavy work, the kind that required full attention and used the repetition of it to keep herself from climbing the walls. Nate worked at the anvil, the rhythm of it steady and grounding in a way she had come to depend on without quite deciding to. At 3 o'clock, a boy arrived at the forge door with a telegram slip. Clara took it. Read it again. Nate, he was at her side in 4 steps. The telegram was from James Aldrin in Denver. It was brief, and it was devastating in the best possible way. Aldrin had retained the original will documentation, along with 2 additional signed witness statements that had been part of the original filing statements, from neighbors who had been present when Clara's mother signed. He was sending the full file by express courier, overnight, arriving Saturday morning. He was also, at his own professional initiative, sending a copy directly to the territorial governor's land office. Because he had reviewed the sequence of events described in Clara's telegram and believed there were grounds for a formal inquiry into the conduct of the district court. The territorial governor's office. Clara read that line 3 times. He went above the district bench, she said. He went around Pruitt entirely, Nate said. He was reading over her shoulder, and she could hear something in his voice she hadn't heard before, not quite excitement, but the closest thing to it she'd encountered in him. Can he do that? If there's reason to suspect the court is compromised? Yes. He straightened. The governor's land office has oversight authority. If they flag Pruitt's involvement as a conflict of interest. Hargrove loses his judge, Clara said. Hargrove loses his judge, Nate confirmed. She sat down. The back of her knees had gone the way they'd gone on the walk back from the courthouse when she and Nate had filed the will, that particular weakness that came not from fear but from relief, so large it had to find somewhere to go. My mother, she said. She had witnesses. She made sure it was witnessed. She knew, Nate said quietly. She knew Randall well enough to make sure it couldn't be undone. Clara pressed the telegram flat against the table and put her hand on top of it. She felt her mother in that gesture, that careful, quiet woman who had sewn things with her hands and protected her daughter the only way she could. With paper and ink and 2 neighbors and a land attorney in Billings who had held the truth in a drawer for 11 years. She left me 20 acres, Clara said. She left me a way out. She left you a foundation, Nate said. You built the way out yourself. She looked up at him. He was standing beside her table with his arms at his sides and his expression carrying that thing it sometimes carried that she had no clean word for attentiveness. She might have called it, if that word were larger than it was. The specific quality of a person who was wholly present for what you were experiencing. She wanted to say something that matched the weight of the moment. What she said was, I'm glad I knocked on your door. Nate looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, so am I. Every day. He went back to the anvil. She went back to the canvas. The forge fire settled. Outside, the summer afternoon moved on, indifferent and warm and full of things they hadn't gotten to yet. Saturday morning, the courier arrived before 7. A leather satchel, sealed, addressed to Clara Hensley Cade, containing a file 2 inches thick. Original documents, notarized copies, witness statements, the complete chain of custody from her mother's hand to James Aldrin's office, to this table in a blacksmith's kitchen in Harlan's Creek, Montana. Clara spread it all across the table while Nate stood across from her, and they went through it page by page. And by the time they reached the witness statements, Clara's hands were entirely steady in a way that felt new, not the steadiness of suppressed fear, but the steadiness of someone who has run out of things to be afraid of. Because the truth has turned out to be on her side. The witnesses were 2 women, Mrs. Adeline Soper and Miss Ruth Calloway. Both of Billings, both per the dates still living. Aldrin had included current addresses. We need their depositions, Clara said. I'll ride to Billings tomorrow, Nate said. She looked up. That's 2 days' ride, 1 day if I push it, he said. I've made the ride in a day before. The file goes to Whitfield on Monday, he said. I leave at dawn tomorrow, reach Billings by evening, speak to both women, come back Monday morning. He said it the way he said practical things, not as if it were simple, but as if the difficulty of it was simply a variable to be accounted for, not a reason to stop. Clara looked at him. She said, not the small, why has it been moved? The larger one, the one she'd been carrying since the first night. He understood which question she was asking. She saw it in the slight shift of his face. Because it matters, he said. Because you matter. He paused in the way that meant he was deciding how much to say. I've been alone a long time, Clara. Not by accident. I lost my family's land when I was young because I trusted people I shouldn't have, and I was too proud to ask for help until it was too late. I came out here because I thought being alone was the safe version of living. He looked at the table, at the spread of documents that held the shape of her mother's love and her brother's betrayal. I was wrong. I think I knew it before you knocked on my door. But you made it impossible to pretend I didn't. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not easy to know, he said. I know that. I don't say things easily. He stopped. Started again. I don't know how to do this the way men in stories do it. With the right words at the right time. I only know how to show up and do the work and hope that's enough. Nate, Clara said. He looked at her. It's enough, she said. It has always been enough. He held her gaze for a long moment, that particular stillness of his, which she now understood was not distance but depth. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd made a decision that settled something. I'll leave at dawn, he said. He left at dawn. Clara woke to the sound of the horse being readied and came to the door in time to see him tighten the last strap of the saddlebag and swing up with the easy economy of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He looked at her in the doorway. Lock up at night, he said. I always do. Dora's 2 streets over if you need anything. I know. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned the horse and rode. She stood in the doorway and watched him until the sound of hooves faded into the summer morning, and then she went inside and stood in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and iron and the particular scent she had come to associate with him. And she felt his absence in the room, the way you felt the absence of a fire that had been burning for warmth. She had not expected to feel it that much. She had not expected a great many things about the last 3 weeks. Randall came on Sunday afternoon. Not with Greer, not with Hargrove's lawyer. Alone, which was the version of him she trusted least. Randall alone meant Randall trying something he didn't want witnesses to. He knocked, which surprised her. She opened the door but did not step back from it. He looked worse than he had in the courthouse. Something in his face had given way in the last few days, the calculation thinning out and something rawer showing through underneath. He was still her brother, and she was not immune to that, and she hated that she wasn't. Cade's not here, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been watching the forge then. No, she said, he isn't. I want to talk to you. So talk. He shifted his weight. Can I come in? No. He absorbed this. He looked at the door frame and then at her face and then somewhere past her shoulder. Hargrove's pulling out, he said. Clara went completely still. His lawyer sent me a letter this morning, Randall said. Withdrawing from the challenge. From all of it. Something about the governor's office inquiry. They're asking questions about the district court, about Pruitt, and Hargrove doesn't want his name attached to anything that gets that kind of attention. He laughed, but it was a hollow sound. He threw me over. Just like that. Sent a letter and threw me over. Clara looked at her brother's face and saw, for the first time in years, something she recognized from when they were children, before their first deaths and their mother's death, and every decision Randall had made to become the person he was. Something that looked briefly like a lost person. She did not trust it, but she saw it. What do you want, Randall? She said. He was quiet for a moment. I need the debt paid, he said. Prentice is calling the note. I don't have the money, Clara. I don't. If I lose the 20 acres, I lose everything. You never owned those 20 acres, she said. That's my land. That was always my land. The other 20, he said quickly. My half. If I can't pay Prentice's note, he'll foreclose. I'll lose my half too. He looked at her with something she wasn't sure she'd ever seen in him before. I know I don't have any right to ask you anything. No, she said, you don't. I'm asking anyway. His voice went low. You're the only person left who you're my sister, Clara. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about 7 years. She thought about a letter he'd intercepted, and an answer he'd written in her name, and a will he'd known about, and sat on while she worked herself hollow, trying to build something from nothing. She thought about a woman who had sewn careful seams and filed careful documents, and trusted that the truth would eventually reach her daughter. She thought about what her mother would have done. "I won't help you pay the debt," she said. "I won't give you money, and I won't co-sign anything, and I won't pretend the last 7 years didn't happen." Randall's face fell. "But I'll talk to Prentice," she said. "I'll ask him to restructure the note. Smaller payments over a longer term. That's all I'll do, and it's conditional on one thing." He looked at her. "You sign a statement," she said. "A sworn statement, witnessed and filed with the land office, acknowledging that you knew about the will. That you intercepted my letters. That the 40 acres were always split." She held his gaze. "You sign that, and I'll speak to Prentice. You don't sign, and I walk back inside and close this door." The silence was long enough that she began to count the seconds. "That statement," he stopped. "That would damage me." "People would know." "People are going to know anyway," Clara said. "The territorial inquiry will pull the land records and the mail records, and before this is done, everyone in this county is going to understand exactly what you did. The only question is whether it comes out as something you admitted or something that got dragged out of you." He looked at the ground. He looked at his hands. He looked, for one raw moment, like the boy she'd grown up with before everything went wrong. "All right," he said quietly. She did not soften. "I'll have the statement drawn up. You'll come to the land office and sign it in front of Garber. Tuesday morning." "All right," he said again. She nodded. "That's all for now, Randall. Go home." He went. She closed the door and stood with her back against it, and breathed through the complicated tangle of what she felt, not triumph, not exactly. Something more mixed. The grief of a person who loved someone who had repeatedly chosen to harm them, and the particular exhaustion of finally, deciding that love was not the same thing as surrender. She was still standing there when she heard hoofbeats she recognized. She opened the door. Nate was riding back into the yard. A full day earlier than she'd expected. He looked road-worn but alert, and he swung down from the horse with something in his expression she'd never seen before: urgency, stripped of its usual careful packaging. "Both women are willing," he said before she could speak. "Soper and Calloway, both alive, both clear-minded, both furious that the will was held so long without reaching you. They'll give depositions to Aldrin's office. He'll have them notarized and to Whitfield before Monday noon." Clara stared at him. "You made it in a day. Pushed hard," he said. He handed the reins to the hook by the door, and then stopped when he saw her face really looked at her, the way he did when he was reading past the surface. "What happened?" "Hargrove withdrew," she said. "Randall came. I told him I'd speak to Prentice if he signs a sworn statement admitting everything." Nate was still, and he agreed, she said. Nate let out a slow breath. He looked at her for a long moment, all of her, the whole shape of what she'd done while he was gone. "You handled all of that," he said. "I did," she said. "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'm sad in a way I don't know what to do with yet. But yes, I'm all right." He took a step toward her, and then stopped, like a man who had started a motion and wasn't sure he had the right to complete it. He was still dusty from the road. His hat was in his hand, and his face had that particular openness it got when he wasn't managing what showed. "I thought about you the whole ride," he said. "About whether you were safe. About whether Randall." He stopped, set his jaw. "I didn't like being gone." "I didn't like you being gone," she said. They stood 4 feet apart in the doorway of the forge, and the summer evening settled warm around them, and neither of them moved, but the distance between them felt different than it had been, thinner, somehow. Like something that had been holding its breath was starting, carefully, to exhale. "Come inside," Clara said. "I'll make supper." He came inside. She made supper. They ate at the small table where they had learned to talk to each other, and the conversation was quieter than usual and warmer than usual. And at one point she reached across the table for the bread, and her hand brushed his on the table, and neither of them moved immediately. Then he turned his hand over. She looked down at it. At the burn-scared forearm and the broad palm and the fingers that had been building things and mending things and protecting things for 36 years. She put her hand in his. He held it the way he held everything, firmly, carefully, with the attention of a man who understood that what he was holding had weight and worth and deserved to be held well. They sat there for a while. The fire in the stove ticked down. The summer dark came on outside, and something that had been building since an August evening when a desperate woman knocked on a forge door finished building itself quietly, in the way that the most real things finish, not with an announcement, but with a settled certainty that felt, from the inside, like it had always been true. The storm that was coming: Whitfield's recommendation, Pruett's response, the territorial inquiry, the sworn statement, all the remaining machinery of justice and consequence that had yet to run its course, none of it had passed. It was still coming. But for this hour, in this kitchen, with this man's hand warm and certain around hers, Clara Hensley Cade sat still in the middle of her own life and felt something she had almost given up believing in. She felt like she was going to be fine. More than fine. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Whitfield's recommendation landed on Monday morning like a stone thrown into still water, the impact sharp, the ripples immediate and wide. Clara was at the telegraph office with Nate when Coop handed them the copy that had been routed through the land office. Whitfield had submitted his preliminary finding to Judge Pruett at 8 o'clock. The finding was 3 pages. Clara read it standing at the counter while Nate read over her shoulder, and Coop pretended to sort papers and listened to every word. Whitfield had found the will valid, not tentatively, not with qualifications or suggestions for further review. Valid, the word sitting in the middle of the second page, with the flat certainty of a man who had looked at the evidence and found it unambiguous. The original filing, the witness signatures, the chain of custody through Aldrin's office. The depositions from Adeline Soper and Ruth Calloway Whitfield had laid it all out in the careful language of his profession and arrived at a conclusion that left no comfortable room for Pruett to work around. Clara read it twice. Then she looked at Nate. "It's over," she said. "It's not over," he said quietly. "Pruett still has to rule." She understood what he meant. A judge with a compromised interest and a man like Hargrove behind him didn't always let evidence determine his conclusions. The finding was good. The finding was better than good. But Pruett still held the gavel. "The governor's office," she said. "That's the question," Nate said. "Whether they've moved fast enough." They had their answer before noon. Dora Pell arrived at the forge at 11:45, moving at the fastest pace Clara had yet seen from her, which on Dora constituted something close to a controlled run. She came through the forge door without knocking first and stood in the kitchen doorway, with her hand on the frame and her chest working. "The territorial marshal is in town," she said. Clara put down the seam she was working. "Here? Now rode in an hour ago. He went straight to the courthouse." Dora caught her breath. "He has a writ from the governor's land office. Pruett been suspended from the case pending the inquiry. A substitute judge has been appointed, a man named Carver, out of Helena. He's arriving Wednesday." The kitchen was very quiet for 3 full seconds. Then Nate said, "Aldrin moved faster than I expected." "Aldrin and whoever helped him move fast," Clara said. She was looking at Dora. "How is Pruett taking it?" "About as well as you'd imagine," Dora said, recovering herself and sitting down with the air of a woman who had earned her chair. "He was in his chambers when the marshal arrived. There was shouting. The marshal apparently did not raise his voice even once, which I'm told made it considerably worse." She paused. "Hargrove left town this morning, early, before the marshal arrived. Someone told him last night, I'd guess. He ran," Clara said. "He reorganized his priorities," Dora said with precision. Men like Hargrove don't run. They simply find themselves urgently needed elsewhere. Nate was at the workbench, and he had stopped working, and was listening with his back to the room, in the way that meant he was thinking through implications. Clara watched the line of his shoulders and could almost see the calculation moving through him. "Carver," he said, "out of Helena. Do you know anything about him?" Dora considered. "I know he presided over the Callison water rights case in '81 and ruled against the larger landowner." "That's all I have." "That's enough," Nate said. He turned around. "Carver rules on evidence. Pruitt ruled on relationships. Those are different courts." Clara felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for so long she'd stopped registering the tension. It released now, slowly, like a rope being paid out hand over hand, and the relief of it was almost painful in its thoroughness. "Tuesday," she said. "Randall signs the statement on Tuesday. And Wednesday the new judge arrives." She looked at Nate. "We need to be ready." "We're ready," he said. "We've been ready." Tuesday morning arrived with the particular weight of days that matter. Clara dressed carefully, not to impress, but because the occasion required her to show up as the fullest version of herself, and she had learned that the fullest version of herself deserved the effort. She chose the dress she'd mended herself on the third day in the forge. The dark blue one that her mother had once told her made her look like a woman who knew her own mind. She walked to the land office beside Nate at 8 o'clock, and Randall was already there when they arrived. He was standing outside the land office door, hat in his hands, looking like a man who had not slept. There were new lines in his face that Clara hadn't seen before. And the careful arrangement he usually maintained, the posture of a man performing confidence, had dropped away and left something more honest and considerably less comfortable in its place. He looked at Clara when she came up the steps. He looked at her husband. He looked at the door. "I'm here," he said. "I can see that," Clara said. They went inside. Garber had the statement prepared. It was 2 pages. Clara had dictated it to Dora the evening before, and Dora had transcribed it with the focused precision of a woman who wanted every word correct. And then they had walked it to Garber's office, and he had formatted it for official record. 2 pages that said plainly and specifically what Randall had known and when and what he had done with that knowledge. Garber set it on the counter. He set a pen beside it. He looked at Randall with the careful neutrality of a man whose job required him to witness things without editorializing about them. Randall picked up the statement. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. The room had the particular silence of people who are not speaking because what needs to happen does not require speech. Then Randall set the paper down, picked up the pen, and signed his name. Clara watched him do it. She watched his hand move and the ink take hold, and the signature settle into the paper as something permanent and witnessed and real, and she felt the 7 years behind her shift in their weight, not disappear, not forgive, but shift. Become something that had a shape she could hold rather than a force that held her. Garber witnessed the signature. He stamped the document. He filed it. "That's recorded," Garber said. "Mrs. Cade, you'll want a copy, please," she said. He made her a copy, and she took it and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. And she and Nate walked out of the land office into the summer morning, and Randall came out behind them, and they stood on the steps. For a moment, the three of them, in the particular awkwardness of people who share blood and history and nothing comfortable. Randall looked at Clara. "I'll speak to Prentice myself," he said. "You don't need to." "I said I would," Clara said. "I keep my word." Something crossed his face. "I know you do," he said. "You always have." He paused. "I don't expect you to forgive me." "Good," she said, "because I don't know yet if I will." She looked at him steadily. "But I know I'm done carrying what you did as if it were mine to carry. It was yours. Now it's on record as yours. That's what I needed." He nodded once. He put his hat on. He walked down the steps and up the street, and she watched him go with a complex, imprecise feeling, of a woman who has finally set down something very heavy and is still adjusting to the strange lightness of her own hands. Nate stood beside her and did not say anything, which was exactly right. After a moment she said, "Prentice at 2? 2 o'clock," he confirmed. They went home. Prentice received them at 2 with the expression of a man who had been following the week's developments closely and had formed several opinions he was too professional to volunteer. He agreed to restructure Randall's note smaller payments, 18 months, with the condition that any default return the matter to its immediate full collection. He wrote it up while they sat across from him, and he passed it across the desk to Clara rather than to Nate, which was a small thing and the correct thing, and she appreciated it without making anything of it. She signed as guarantor of the arrangement, not as payer as guarantor. The distinction mattered. She was not saving Randall. She was creating the conditions under which he might save himself, if he chose to, and releasing herself from any obligation beyond that. When they left Prentice's office, Nate held the door and she walked through it, and the afternoon sun hit her face, and she stopped on the sidewalk and tipped her face up toward it. For a moment, eyes closed. "You all right?" Nate asked. "I'm good," she said. "I'm genuinely, actually good." She heard something in his silence that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, and she opened her eyes and looked at him and found she was right the corner of his mouth, that rare and careful thing. "Good," he said. "You've earned it." Judge Carver arrived on Wednesday on the afternoon's stage and went directly to the courthouse, which told the town something about the kind of man he was. No dinner first, no settling in at the hotel, the courthouse. The files, the work. By Thursday morning he had reviewed Whitfield's recommendation and the complete file that Aldrin had sent from Denver. By Thursday afternoon, he had requested a brief meeting with Clara and Nate, which they attended with Aldrin's authorization to speak on the legal record. Carver was a lean man in his 60s with a face like weathered oak and eyes that had seen a considerable portion of the territory's complicated history and had not been made romantic or cynical by it, only precise. He sat across from them in the courthouse's side room, and he read from the file and he asked 4 questions, all of them specific. All of them answered by the documentation they had assembled. At the end of the 4th answer, he closed the folder. "The will is valid," he said. "The land split stands as filed. The challenge is dismissed." He looked at Clara directly. "I want you to understand that the conduct of this process, the delay in the will's execution, the interception of correspondence, the manipulation of debt arrangements, these are matters that the territorial inquiry will continue to examine. Your sworn statement from your brother has been entered into that inquiry's record. The outcome of that process is not something I can speak to today." He paused. "What I can tell you is that as far as this court is concerned, you own 20 acres of land in Harlan's Creek, free and clear, as of this ruling." Clara held the words in her chest for a moment. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "Don't thank me," Carver said, not unkindly. "Thank whoever raised you to keep records." He stood and shook both their hands and walked back to his other business, and Clara and Nate walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon for the second time in 2 weeks. But this time the paper in her hand had a judge's signature on it, and the weight of it was entirely different. Not the weight of a document in progress, of a fight still being fought, but the weight of a settled thing. She owned her land. It was hers. It had always been hers, and now the world had caught up with that fact. What nobody had anticipated was Martha Coombs. 3 days after Carver's ruling, on a Saturday afternoon when the forge was quiet and Clara was working at the window table, the sewing machine she'd been saving toward had arrived Thursday. A fact she was still adjusting to, because Nate had ordered it 3 weeks ago without telling her. Simply noted the model she'd mentioned and written to the supplier in Billings, and presented her with the shipping notice on Thursday morning with the same plainness he brought to everything the millinery. Owner appeared at the forge door for the second time. Clara heard the knock and went to answer it herself, because Nate was working, and she was not going to perform unavailability for Martha Coombs. She opened the door. Martha Coombs stood on the step with a wrapped parcel in her hands and an expression that was doing several complicated things at once. The confidence she'd brought the first time was present but altered, still upright, but carrying something underneath it that Clara needed a moment to identify. It was discomfort, the particular discomfort of a person who has been wrong and knows it, and has decided at some personal cost to do something about it. "Mrs. Cade," Martha said. The name correctly this time and carefully. "Mrs. Coombs," Clara said. Martha extended the parcel. "I brought this." She paused. "It's fabric. From my stock. The good cotton, not the remnants." Another pause, shorter and more effortful. "I owe you an apology." Clara looked at the parcel and then at the woman holding it. "I said things about you that were not fair," Martha said. Her voice had the cadence of a speech practiced in private and now being delivered at some personal expense. "I assumed the worst about your intentions, and I said so publicly, and I was wrong. What you did, how you've handled yourself, I've been watching, and I was wrong." She pushed the parcel slightly forward. "I know fabric isn't enough, but it's what I have." Clara took the parcel. It was heavier than it looked. The good cotton was thick, a deep cream color. "Enough for a proper dress, maybe two." "Thank you," Clara said. She meant it. Martha's posture loosened fractionally. "I also want to say, and this is the harder part, so I'd appreciate it if you'd let me finish." She took a breath. "I know what it's like to need something that the town has decided you shouldn't have. I know what it's like to be talked about in ways that have nothing to do with who you actually are. I have been the one doing the talking this time, and I'm ashamed of it." She met Clara's eyes. "You're a good woman. I should have seen that sooner." Clara looked at Martha Coombs, the millinery owner, the town's social authority, the woman who had stood in her doorway and called her a trap. She looked at the effort it had taken to climb these steps and say these words. "Would you like to come in?" Clara said. Something in Martha's face opened like a window. "I would, if you're willing. I'm willing." They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked for an hour, and by the end of it something had shifted in the room between them, not friendship yet, but the precondition for it. The acknowledgement that two women who had been wrong about each other might, given time and honesty, become something more useful to each other than enemies. When Martha left, Nate came to the kitchen doorway. He had clearly been in earshot for some portion of it. "Martha Coombs," he said. "People can surprise you," Clara said. He considered this. "Some of them. More than you'd think," she said. He looked at her with the particular expression she'd come to treasure, the one that appeared when she said something he hadn't expected, and it went somewhere true. "Maybe," he said. The twist came on a Monday morning, 12 days after Carver's ruling, and it came from a direction none of them had been watching. A man arrived at the forge, not Hargrove, not Randall, not anyone from the town or the court or any of the machinery that had occupied the last month. A man she had never seen, well-dressed and road-dusty, who asked for Mrs. Caden removed his hat when she answered the door. "My name is Aldrin," he said. "James from Denver." Clara stared at him. "You came yourself." "I did." He smiled briefly, a man in his 60s, with the kind of face that had been handsome, and was now distinguished. "There are things that ought to be delivered in person." "May I come in?" She brought him inside. Nate came from the forge. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Aldrin set his briefcase on the floor and opened it, and he took out a folder, and he set it on the table between them. "Your mother," Aldrin said, "was a very thorough woman." Clara looked at the folder. "What is this?" "When your mother filed the will with me," Aldrin said, "she also filed a second document. A private letter. She asked me to hold it until the will was formally executed." He paused. "She asked that it be given to you personally, in the presence of whoever you trusted most at the time of delivery." He looked at Nate. "I'll assume this gentleman qualifies." "He does," Clara said immediately. Aldrin slid the folder across the table. Clara opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. The letter was 4 pages in her mother's handwriting. The handwriting she would have known anywhere, the careful slanted script of a woman who had written shopping lists and mending notes, and the occasional letter in the same precise hand. As if everything that deserved to be written well. She read it aloud, because she needed to hear the words in the air, and because Nate was beside her and she found she wanted him to hear it too. Her mother had known. She had known about Randall's debts and his nature, and the use to which he was likely to put her children's inheritance. She had known she was dying before the doctor confirmed it, the particular knowledge that some bodies give their owners in advance of the official diagnosis. She had used the time she had left to protect the only one of her children, who, as she wrote it, had always been more interested in being good than in being safe. The letter said, "You were always braver than you knew. I tried to leave you something to stand on when the brave part got too heavy. I hope it was enough. I hope by the time you read this, you found your footing. I think you will. You always land on your feet, even when you fall hard first." Clara set the letter down on the table when she reached the end of the 4th page. She put both hands flat on the table, and she looked at the window and she breathed. Nate put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. He simply put his hand over hers and left it there, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle somewhere central and necessary. She knew, Clara said. Yes, Nate said. She knew, and she made sure anyway. Yes, she believed I'd get here. He was quiet for a moment. Then she was right. Aldrin sat across the table, with the careful stillness of a man who understood that he was in the presence of something private. After a moment he said quietly, "There is one more thing." Clara looked up. He reached into the briefcase again. He set a second document on the table. Clara looked at it without picking it up, reading the header from where she sat. The document was a deed for the creek, the half-mile of water access that ran through the eastern portion of the Hensley land, her 20 acres. Her mother had, in a separate and carefully constructed transaction 11 years prior, registered the water rights as a distinct parcel tied specifically to Clara's inheritance. Not to the land in general, to Clara specifically. The water rights that Hargrove had wanted, had built his entire scheme around acquiring. Had tried to purchase and intimidate and legally maneuver his way toward for the better part of 2 months. They had been Clara's the entire time, formally, specifically, legally, undeniably hers. Her mother had seen to it. Clara looked at the deed. She looked at Aldrin. She looked at Nate. Nate was looking at the deed with an expression she had never seen on him before, not quite disbelief, because Nate was not a man who gave himself to disbelief easily, but something adjacent to wonder. The expression of a man who has been watching someone build something in the dark and has just understood that the foundation was always stronger than anyone knew. "She put the water rights in my name," Clara said. 11 years ago, Aldrin confirmed, before she was ill. She told me she wanted to make certain that if the land ever became a point of conflict, the piece of it most likely to attract that conflict would have a clear and indisputable owner. He paused. She knew water was going to matter in this valley. She was a practical woman. She was extraordinary, Clara said. Yes, Aldrin agreed she was. Clara picked up the water rights deed and held it, and thought about her mother, at whatever age she'd been when she walked into Aldrin's Denver office and quietly, without drama, without anyone knowing, put her daughter's future on record. A woman who had not been able to give her daughter safety while she was alive, but had done everything within her power to make sure the safety would be there when it was needed. She had given Clara land. She had given her water. She had given her a letter that said, "I knew you could." Clara set the deed down next to the letter, and she pressed her hand flat over both of them, and she did not cry because she had cried enough in the last month to last her some time. But she felt the grief and the love of it move through her in one long wave that left something cleaner in its wake. "What do I do with the water rights?" she said, when she could. Nate looked at her. "Whatever you want," he said. "They're yours." "I know that," she said. "I'm asking what you think." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. The valley needs water access, he said. Not just Hargrove's people. The smaller ranches, the families on the east side. If the water rights were managed as a community resource rather than a private one, he paused. You could deed an easement to the town. Keep the land but allow managed access. It's been done in other territories. It gives you control without using it as a weapon. A weapon is the last thing I want, Clara said. I know, he said. She looked at him. This man who had taken her in on a desperate summer night and ridden a day's road without complaint and turned his hand over on a kitchen table and said quietly, "Not to me." This man who had been alone for the wrong reasons and had chosen one ordinary evening to open a door. "Let's do that," she said. "The easement. Let's make it a community resource." Aldrin, who had been listening with the quiet approval of a man watching something be done right, made a note in his folder. "I'll draft the easement documents," he said. "You can review them before the end of the week." "Thank you," Clara said, "for coming yourself, for everything." He waved it off in the manner of a man who found thanks for doing his job unnecessary. "Your mother was a client for 15 years, he said. "This was the least I could do." He stood and collected his briefcase. "She would have been very proud, Mrs. Cade." He said goodbye to both of them and let himself out, and the kitchen was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that follows something large. Nate looked at the letter and the deed still spread on the table. He looked at Clara. "You should keep those somewhere safe," he said. "I will." She didn't move to put them away yet, Nate. He looked at her. "When this is all settled," she said. "The easement, the inquiry, all of it. I want to do something." "All right. I want to start the seamstress business properly," she said. "With the machine. Real commissions, not just repairs and basic mending. I've been thinking about the bridal work. There's nothing in this county for it. Women are ordering from catalogs and getting things that don't fit and don't matter to them." She looked at him with the particular directness she'd been growing into for the past month. "I want to build something. Something that's mine." "Then build it," he said. "I'll need to use the side room," she said. "The one you use for storage. It's yours. Just like that?" He looked at her steadily. "You are my wife, Clara. What's mine is yours. I thought that was understood." She looked at him, this quiet, deliberate, entirely extraordinary man, and felt the fullness of it all settle in her chest like something she could rest on. "I'm going to need a sign," she said, "for the business." He looked at her with a faint smile. "I make signs," he said. "Iron letters. I've done them before." "Of course you have," she said. "What do you want it to say?" She thought about it. She thought about a woman in Denver with a careful hand. She thought about a forge door on a summer night. She thought about 20 acres and water rights, and a judge named Carver, and a signed statement, and a hand turned over on a kitchen table. "Hensley," she said. "Hensley Cade. After my mother's name." He nodded. "I'll start it tomorrow." She picked up her mother's letter and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside the deed and set both of them by the window where the afternoon light could reach them. Outside, Harlan's Creek went on with its business, loud and ordinary, and entirely unaware that inside one forge on the north end of town, something had just finished being built that would last considerably longer than iron. The iron sign went up on a Thursday. Nate had worked on it for 6 evenings in a row, coming in late from the forge with his hands dark from the metal, eating supper quietly and going back out. Clara had heard him working after she went to bed, the careful, particular sound of finishing work, slower and more precise than his regular forge rhythm. She had not gone to look. She understood that he was making something, and that the making of it was his to do in his own time. When he carried it out Thursday morning and mounted it above the door of the side room, she was standing in the yard with her coffee, and she read it and had to look away for a moment. Hensley Cade, Seamstress and Alterations. The letters were iron, each one formed with the same attention he brought to everything he made clean edges, proper weight, built to last in weather and in time. He had added a small detail at the end of the name, a single curved line that she recognized after a moment as a needle threaded through fabric, rendered in iron so small and precise she had to step closer to confirm it. "You put a needle on it," she said. "Seemed appropriate," he said. "When did you learn to do something that small?" "I've always been able to do small work," he said. "I just don't usually have a reason." He looked at the sign and then at her. "Does it suit?" She looked at the sign, at her mother's name joined to his, at the needle that no one but a person who looked closely would notice. "It's perfect," she said. He nodded once. He went back to his forge. She went back inside to begin her first full day of real work in the room that was now hers, and she sat down at the machine she'd been saving for, across 7 years, and she felt, underneath everything else, the specific joy of a person who has finally arrived at something they were always supposed to be doing. The first commission came from Dora Pell, which surprised no one. The second came from the wife of the ranch supply owner, which surprised Clara somewhat, given the woman's neutrality during the yard confrontation. The third came from Martha Coombs, which surprised everyone, including Martha, who appeared in the doorway of the workroom with the careful posture of a woman making a point without stating it, and said she needed alterations on 4 dresses and had heard the machine work was precise. "It is," Clara said, and took the commission. By the end of the second week, she had 7 commissions, and had turned down 2 she didn't have time for. By the end of the third week, she had been asked about bridal work by the daughter of one of the East Side ranchers, a young woman named Jessie Holt, who had gotten engaged the previous spring and had been putting off the dress question because everything available by catalog looked like something made for a person who was not her. Clara sat down with Jessie for an hour, asking questions and making notes and listening to the specific, particular vision this young woman had for the day she was going to remember for the rest of her life. She had not done bridal work in 3 years. She had missed it, the intimacy of it, the way it required you to understand not just a body but a person. When Jessie left, Clara sat at her table for a moment with her notes and felt something she recognized as happiness. Not the relief she'd been confusing for happiness the past several weeks, the relief of threats receding and land being secured and battles being won. This was different, quieter and more durable, the specific warmth of a person doing what they were built to do. She went to the forge door and said, "Nate." He turned from the anvil. "I have a bridal commission," she said. Something in his expression shifted, not the near smile, not the warmth exactly, but the look he got when something she said landed as right. "Good," he said. "I wanted you to know." "I know," he said. "I could hear you two talking." She seemed pleased when she left. Clara leaned against the doorframe. "Are you always this aware of everything happening around you?" "I pay attention," he said. "You know that about me by now." "I do," she said. "I like it about you." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I like a lot of things about you," he said. It came out plainly, the way he said everything, and it hit her the way plain things hit when they're fully meant directly, without cushion, right in the center. She went back to her work, but she carried it with her for the rest of the afternoon. The Territorial Inquiry's first public finding arrived on a Friday, 6 weeks after Carver's ruling, and it landed in Harlan's Creek the way large things land in small places all at once, through every available channel simultaneously. Dora had a copy before noon. The courthouse had posted it by 2. By 3 o'clock, the main street was running with conversation. Judge Pruitt had been formally removed from his position, pending a full territorial review of his conduct across 12 cases in the previous 5 years. 3 of those cases involved Clifford Hargrove. 4 involved disputed land arrangements in which Hargrove held financial interests. The finding described a pattern of rulings that favored connected parties in a manner inconsistent with the evidence presented. Hargrove himself had been served with a civil complaint from the Territorial Land Office. The complaint alleged improper influence in 2 water rights disputes, the coercive use of debt arrangements to acquire land from financially vulnerable parties, and conduct related to his involvement in the challenge to Clara's will. He had retained legal representation in Denver and was, by all accounts, preparing for a fight that was going to be expensive and long and public. He would not win it. Clara understood this without being told. Men like Hargrove were formidable in environments they controlled, where the judge was their friend, and the debtors were afraid, and the machinery bent to their preferences. They were considerably less formidable when the machinery belonged to someone else. She read the finding at her workroom table with Jesse Holt's bridal notes beside it, and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and she felt something she hadn't fully let herself feel yet: vindication. Not triumph, not satisfaction at someone else's loss, but the specific and righteous feeling of truth having been taken seriously by the people whose job it was to take it seriously. Her mother had filed a will. 2 women in Billings had witnessed it. A Denver attorney had held it carefully for 11 years. A territorial examiner had read it and called it valid. A judge from Helena had agreed. And the whole careful architecture of lies that Randall and Hargrove had built around her, the intercepted letters, the leveraged debts, the arranged marriage to a man she feared, the plan to strip her of the land and water that were always hers, had come apart under the simple, relentless pressure of the truth being documented. She looked out the window at the forge, where she could hear the steady sound of Nate working. She thought about the night she had run through the summer dark toward the sound of that hammer. She thought about how close she had come to not knocking. About the 10 minutes she had stood outside the door, with her hand raised and her courage requiring itself from her one more time. She was so glad she had knocked. Aunt Vera arrived on a Tuesday in late September, 6 weeks after the inquiry findings, and she arrived the way people arrived when they had been waiting too long to arrive, all at once. With a trunk that was too large for the stage, and a manner that took up space without apology, and eyes that went immediately to Clara's face and stayed there. Clara had been in the yard when the stage came through, and she had seen the woman step down, 62 years old, built like their mother but broader, with gray hair and the particular carriage of someone who had made peace with taking up room in the world, and she had known immediately. There was no question. The line of the jaw, the way she held her head. She walked across the yard, and Vera opened her arms, and Clara walked into them, and the hug was the kind that only happened between people who had been separated too long by circumstances that should never have separated them. They held on for a full minute without speaking. When they finally stepped back, Vera held Clara at arm's length and looked at her the way her mother used to look at her all the way in, not at the surface. "You look like her," Vera said. "You always did. But now you look like you know it." "I'm getting there," Clara said. Vera looked past her to the forge, where Nate had appeared in the doorway, reading the situation and staying back to give it room. "Is that him?" "That's him," Clara said. Vera studied him for a moment with the candid assessment of a woman who had earned the right to her opinions. Then she said, "He has good hands." Clara looked at Nate across the yard. At his forearms and his steadiness, and the way he stood in the doorway of the thing he'd built, patient and present, and entirely himself. "He does," she said. Vera stayed for 2 weeks. She slept in the sitting room on the cot they moved in, and she filled the forge's small living quarters with the particular energy of a woman who had grieved a mistake for 7 years, and was correcting it now as thoroughly as she knew how. She cooked large meals. She told stories about Clara's mother that Clara had never heard, the girl she'd been before she became someone's wife, the woman she'd been before she became someone's mother. She gave Clara back pieces of her own family that Randall had never known existed because Randall had never thought to ask. Nate absorbed Vera's presence the way he absorbed most things, without complaint, with a quiet accommodation that looked like indifference until you understood that it was actually generosity. He gave them space when they needed it. He joined them at the table in the evenings and listened to the stories, and occasionally, when Vera asked him something directly, answered with the careful precision of a man who was choosing to let someone in. On the 4th evening, Vera asked him how he'd come to be a blacksmith in Harlan's Creek specifically, And he told her about losing the family land, told her more than Clara had heard before. Actually, because Vera had a way of asking questions that made answering them feel like the natural thing to do. He told her about the mistake he'd made, trusting the wrong partner, about the debt that had taken the land his father built, about the years of working for other men's forges before he'd saved enough to buy the one here. You started over, Vera said. I did, he said. That takes something, she said. It takes knowing the alternative is staying where you are, he said. Vera looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has just had a suspicion confirmed. Well, she said. I know, Clara said. Nate looked between them with the expression of a man who is being discussed and is choosing not to comment on it, and Clara caught his eye and smiled, and the corner of his mouth moved in return. And Vera watched this small exchange and said nothing at all, which was, from a woman who always had something to say, the most eloquent possible response. The night before Vera left, they sat at the kitchen table after supper, the three of them, and Vera set down her coffee and looked at Clara with an expression that had something serious beneath the warmth. I want to talk about the land, she said. My sister's land. Both parcels. Clara looked at her. All right, your 20 acres and the water rights are yours and they're settled, and I don't want to discuss those. She folded her hands on the table. I want to discuss Randall's half. Nate looked up from his coffee. He's behind on the restructured payments, Vera said. 3 weeks behind. Clara absorbed this. She had known distantly. Prentice had not contacted her, but she had heard through the usual channels that Randall's management of the arrangement was not going smoothly. She had been letting it sit. She was not sure what the right response was, and she had been giving herself time to find it. I'm not going to cover for him, Clara said carefully. That was never part of the arrangement. I know, Vera said. I'm not asking you to, she paused. I'm asking if you'd object to me buying the note. Clara went still. I have resources, Vera said. My husband left me comfortable. I've been sitting in Denver watching my sister's land be leveraged and mismanaged, and I would like, if you'll permit it, to do something about it. She looked at Clara directly. If I buy Randall's debt from Prentice, I hold the note. And I can structure the arrangement the way I see fit, which would be considerably stricter than Prentice's version. What would you do with it, Clara said, if he defaults on yours? Foreclose, Vera said without hesitation, and add his 20 acres to your 20, and deed the full 40 to you. She held up a hand at what was starting in Clara's expression. Not as charity, as correction. Your mother wanted you to have a foundation. Randall has been standing on part of your foundation for 7 years. If he cannot manage himself responsibly, then the land goes where your mother intended it to go from the beginning. Nate said nothing. Clara looked at him and found him watching her, with the patient expression of a man who had already decided this was her call and was waiting for her to make it. She looked at her aunt, at the determined, clear-eyed woman who had been absent for 7 years, for reasons she could carry guilt over for the rest of her life, and was now trying to be useful in the ways she knew how to be useful. Talk to Prentice, Clara said, but make the payment terms realistic. I don't want him set up to fail. Vera raised an eyebrow. You're being more generous than he deserves. Probably, Clara said. But I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it because I don't want to look back on this in 20 years and find out I became the kind of person who sets traps. She looked at the table. He made his choices. I'll make mine. Vera looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, Your mother would have said exactly that. Clara picked up her coffee and held it in both hands. I know, she said. I learned it from her. Vera left on a Wednesday and took a piece of the summer's weight with her, the good kind of weight, the kind that reminded you were not alone in the world. She had promised to return for Jesse Holt's wedding in the spring, which Clara was making the dress for, and she had promised to write letters that actually reached their recipient. And she had embraced Clara at the stage door with the thoroughness of a woman making up for lost time. The week after Vera left was the first week in 2 months that nothing urgent demanded Clara's attention. No legal proceedings, no examiner visits, no confrontations in ranch yards. The territorial inquiry continued in its bureaucratic remove, and Hargrove's lawyers were managing that in Denver. And Randall was managing himself or not with Vera's note restructured to terms that were firm but survivable, if he chose to treat them seriously. Clara was working, Nate was working. The days were shorter now, September moving into the cooler edges of October, and the forge fire was a more active presence in the evenings, and they had settled into a life together that felt, in its rhythms, like something that had been there longer than 2 months. It was on a Wednesday evening in early October, after supper, when Clara set down her coffee and looked at him across the table and said, without planning to, "I need to tell you something." He set down his own cup and gave her his attention. "When I came to your door that night," she said, "I was asking for a legal arrangement. I told you that clearly, and you gave me that, and I am grateful for it, and I have been grateful for everything since, and I have not wanted to assume anything beyond what we agreed to. Because you were generous, and you didn't make conditions, and I didn't want to make you feel that I was—" She stopped. Started again. "I am not good at this," she said. "I am much better at filing documents and arguing with land office clerks." "I know," he said, the near smile, the careful one. "Keep going." She looked at him, at the man who had turned his hand over on this table and ridden a day's road without complaint and built her a sign with a needle on it. "I am in love with you," she said. "I didn't plan it. I don't think love like this announces itself very often before it's already happened. But I am, and I thought you should know, because you deserve to know, and because I'm done with things I should say going unsaid." The kitchen was very quiet. Nate looked her for a long moment. The full, steady, unhurried attention she had come to understand was the way he looked at things that mattered most. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Clara," he said, "I have been in love with you since the night you held that lantern in the rain," and laughed when it was over. He paused. "I didn't say it because I didn't want you to feel obligated to something you hadn't chosen. You came to me out of necessity. I wanted to be sure you were choosing freely." She stared at him. "You've been in love with me since the storm." "I've been in love with you since the storm," he confirmed. "That was 6 weeks ago." "I know, Nate." She was laughing now, not the startled laugh, but something fuller and warmer that she felt in her whole chest. "You let me spend 6 weeks while I was trying not to assume." "I was waiting for you to be sure," he said, not apologetically. Plainly, the way he said everything that was true. "I would have waited longer." "You are the most infuriating man," she said with complete affection. "I've been told," he said. She looked at their joined hands on the table. She looked at his face open in a way she knew he did not open for many people, and she understood what it cost him and what it meant. "I chose this," she said. "I want you to know that clearly. Whatever I came here for at the beginning, this is different. You are the choice I would make again, knowing everything." His hand tightened on hers. "So would I," he said. Without question. The following months moved the way good things move, with the quiet accumulation of ordinary days that are, taken together, extraordinary. The bridal commission for Jessie Holt became the dress that the whole town talked about after the wedding, the specific particular gown that was undeniably Jessie and undeniably beautiful. And Clara had 2 new commissions before the reception was over. Hensley Cade Seamstress and Alterations became a name in the valley, spoken the way you spoke the names of things you trusted with the ease of familiarity. Nate expanded the forge in late November, adding a second working space for larger commission pieces. He hired a young man named Peter Watts as an apprentice 15 years old, from one of the East Side ranches, with quick hands and the particular hunger of a boy who wanted to learn something that would last. Clara watched Nate teach him with the patience that was simply a feature of who he was, and she thought about all the people in Harlan's Creek who had assumed that patience in a quiet man was distance. It was not. It had never been. The water easement was formalized in December. Aldrin drafted the document. Carver signed it, and Clara stood in the land office and watched Garber file it the creek access, held for the community, managed through a small water board that Clara sat on along with 2 other valley landowners. It was not glamorous work. It was also exactly the right thing, and on some level she thought her mother, who had been a practical woman, would have found it entirely appropriate that the piece of land most fought over had ended up serving the most people. Randall made his payments to Vera every month on time, which surprised Clara more than she expected. She had not spoken to him since the land office steps. She was not ready to, and she was not forcing herself toward readiness, she was letting it develop at its own pace. Because some things could not be rushed, and the version of herself that might eventually find a way toward something with Randall needed time she intended to take. Vera wrote letters. Real ones, long ones, full of Denver news and questions about the business and occasional recipes that arrived in the margins, and which Clara actually made, and which Nate ate without complaint and occasionally said were good. Which from him was the equivalent of effusive praise. The twist that arrived in February was not a blow. It was improbably a gift. A letter from the Territorial Land Office, not the inquiry, which was ongoing and slow in the way bureaucratic processes were slow, but a separate correspondence addressed to both Clara and Nate. It was from an administrator named Howell, and it was brief. In the course of the territorial inquiry into Hargrove's conduct, the investigators had uncovered a prior arrangement involving the Cade Forge property. 4 years earlier, before Nate's purchase, Hargrove had attempted to acquire the forge land, the north end parcel that included the acreage behind the building, through a debt manipulation very similar to the one he'd used against the Hensley land. He had not succeeded because the widow who owned it had sold to Nate before the debt came due. But in the process of the attempted acquisition, Hargrove had filed a speculative claim on a portion of the back acreage that had never been legally resolved because the sale to Nate had moved faster than his claim could be formalized. The inquiry had invalidated the claim; it had no legal basis. But in invalidating it, the Territorial Office had reviewed the full back acreage and discovered that the survey was incomplete, that the parcel was 3 acres larger than the deed described. 3 acres, behind the forge backing up toward the foothills. The letter was informing them that the corrected survey was being filed, and the additional 3 acres were being added to their deed. Nate read the letter twice. He set it on the workbench. He looked at it. 3 acres, he said. That's what it says, Clara said. He looked at the back wall of the forge, past which those 3 acres sat in the foothills, unknown and unharvested. That's room for a house, he said. Clara went very still. A real one, he said. Not these 2 rooms. Something built for 2 people who intend to stay. He looked at her. I've been thinking about it. I didn't want to bring it up until there was something more than thinking. He gestured at the letter. Now there is. She looked at him. You want to build us a house. I want to build you a house, he said. One you choose. Every room, every window, how the kitchen sits, where the light comes in the morning. You tell me what you want, and I'll build it. She thought about her life. About all the places she had lived as an arrangement, a convenience, a necessity. The boarding house, the 2 rooms, even these good as they had been, they were his, which she had been grateful for, and which had never been quite the same thing as hers. With a proper workroom, she said, large windows. North-facing. North-facing for the light, he agreed. And a porch. What direction? She thought about the mornings. About the mountains at the northern horizon that she had never stopped finding miraculous. East, she said, so we can see the mountains in the morning. He nodded. East porch. He looked at her with the open expression she saw now, whenever he chose to show it without cost or hesitation, because he had decided, and Nate's decisions were thorough. Anything else? She thought about the sign above the workroom door. The needle and iron, the name that was both of theirs. I want our name on it, she said, on the door. Hensley Cade, he said. Hensley Cade, she confirmed. He picked up the territorial letter and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Spring, he said. When the ground softens. We'll start in spring. That's 4 months. 4 months to plan it right, he said. I don't build things fast, I build them to last. She looked at him. I know, she said. That's why I trust what you build. They broke ground on the house in April. The whole valley seemed to notice. Peter Watts helped with the framing on the weekends and brought his father along on the second Saturday, and his father brought a neighbor. And by the third weekend, there were 6 men working the back acreage, because that was what communities did. But because collective labor was how things got built that needed building. And Nate had spent 4 years being quietly useful to these men, and they were returning it now without making a ceremony of it. Clara fed them all. She cooked on both stoves, the forge's kitchen alcove, and a borrowed camp set up in the yard, and smell of food brought people past, who stopped and stayed and picked up tools. And, by the end of the first month, the frame was standing on the east-facing hill behind the forge, and you could see from where the porch would be all the way to the northern mountains. Martha Coombs organized a barn-raising-style gathering for the interior work in May, which nobody had asked her to do, and which was exactly the right thing. She managed the logistics with the precision she brought to everything and the grace she was learning to bring to more things, and she and Clara worked side by side in the kitchen alcove giving directions, and the truce between them hardened. Over those 2 days, into something that might actually grow into friendship, given enough time. Jessie Holt arrived with her new husband to help paint. Dora Pell managed the food rotation with military efficiency. The forge had not stopped working during all of this. Nate moved between the construction and the anvil with the particular balance of a man who had always understood that the urgent and the important were not always the same thing, and both required tending. He was also, in between everything else, teaching Clara to ride. This had begun in March when she'd mentioned offhandedly that she had never learned because there had never been an animal available and never anyone who offered to teach her. Nate had looked at her with the expression of a man who has just identified an oversight that needs correcting and said, "We'll start Saturday," and that was that. She was not a natural rider. She was, in fact, comically bad at it for the first 3 weeks, and she did not hide this, and Nate did not condescend about it. And the lessons took place in the yard behind the forge with a steady old mare named June, who had the temperament of a woman who had lived long enough to find most things unexciting. By April, Clara could ride a comfortable distance without causing June any distress. By May, she could canter. By June, she rode out to the land with Nate in the mornings, when the construction was going well and the forge was quiet, and they looked at the mountains, together from horseback. And she thought she had never in her life understood before what it meant to have room. Room to move, room to breathe, room to be exactly who she was without apology or arrangement, or the constant management of someone else's needs at the expense of her own. The house was finished in July. They moved in on a Saturday, which was unremarkable in terms of labor, because there was not much to move what they had. They carried but remarkable in every other sense. The rooms were exactly as she had described them. Large windows facing north for the workroom. East porch with the mountain view. The kitchen sitting where the morning light would find it. 2 doors from the front entry, a proper bedroom, with a window that opened to the summer breeze. And above the front door, mounted in iron, Hensley Cade. She stood in the yard and looked at it for a long time. Nate stood beside her. "Well," she said. "Home," he said. "Home," she confirmed. She took his hand. He held it in the way he held everything, with full attention, with the careful strength of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding, and intended to hold it well. They stood there in the July morning, in front of the house he had built, with his hands and her name on the door, and the mountains stood blue and certain at the horizon, and somewhere behind them the forge fire ticked quietly in its banked state. And Harlan's Creek went on with its business, and the summer air moved through the valley with its usual indifference to human events. But this event it could not make ordinary. Clara Hensley Cade stood on the ground she owned, beside the man she had chosen, in front of the home they had built together. And she felt her mother's careful hand in every stone of it, in the deed that had waited 11 years, and the witness statements that had held, and the attorney who had driven 3 days to deliver a letter in person and say, she would have been proud. She was proud of herself. She had not always known how to do that, and she knew it now, and she was not going to put it down. I want to tell you something, she said to Nate. He looked at her. The night I came to your door, she said, I was so afraid. Not just of Randall or Hargrove. I was afraid that I was too far gone. That I had let too much be taken, and there wasn't enough left to build anything from. She looked at the house. At the sign. At the mountains beyond. I was wrong about that. You were, he said. Because of you, she said. Partly. Only partly, he said. Only partly, she agreed. The rest was already in me. I just door that opened, he said. She looked at him. This quiet, extraordinary, infuriating, patient man who had opened a door on a desperate August evening and never once made her feel that walking through it required anything of her except herself. Yes, she said. A door that opened. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, over the steady beat of him, and she felt it the way she felt the truth of all things now clearly, without fear, with the full and certain weight of a woman who had come through fire and water, and the long years of someone else's choices and had arrived, at last, exactly where she was supposed to be. A woman who had knelt in a forge and asked a stranger for her life. A woman who had stood up, every day since, and claimed it. A woman who had learned, in the doing of it, that rescue was only the beginning, and that the life you built after was entirely, irreversibly, beautifully your own.